Hello, and welcome to this lecture, The Economy of the New South. We'll cover three topics: the growth and structure of manufacturing, the development of extractive industries, and the revival and structure of agriculture. Remember that all of these economic sectors existed before and during the Civil War, but they changed how they were organized and operated between the Civil War and World War I. They also grew, except for agriculture, to what we call industrial scale. Agriculture continued to be the foremost economic activity of the South into the middle of the 20th century. So let's begin with manufacturing. Cotton textile mills had been part of the Southern economy since the 1820s, but after the Civil War, as part of the New South's interest in manufacturing, they grew to industrial scale. The number of mills grew by almost 250% between 1866 and 1900. Later we'll see that the number of spindles dramatically outpaced that, meaning mills were much larger in addition to being more numerous. Textile mills were attractive to outside capital. They were less capital intensive than heavy industry. There were many available workers at low wages, and transportation costs were lower when mills were nearer cotton producing areas. Many mills located in the Piedmont area of the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama, though they were scattered all over. The number of mill hands, sometimes derisively labeled lint heads, grew by 5 times. Textile mills became the domain of white workers who systematically excluded black workers. This exclusion was facilitated by the development of mill villages that provided housing and, if mill owners were humane, social services and recreation. Later this was called corporate welfare. The era of cotton mills lasted until after World War II, and there are still many mill villages left. By the way, other industries incorporated mill villages, and other sections of the country built them, though they were often called company towns. The cotton textile industry was pretty successful, using 8 times more cotton in 1900 than in 1866, but it did not spawn a tool-making industry. Consequently, Southern mills were part of a colonial economy dependent on significant inputs from northern capital and buying tools from outside the area. Wages remained abysmally low for 3 or 4 generations. North Carolina had an exceptional number of cotton mills. This map gives you not only an idea about how they concentrated in the Piedmont of the state's central and western uplands, where heat and humidity conditions were good for cloth production, but also how mills, mill villages, and railroads had a symbiotic relationship. Heavy industry, particularly the making of pig iron and cast iron products like stoves and sewer and water pipe for growing cities, found a home in the South. Again, because there were many low-wage workers and capital investments were readily available. The founding of Birmingham in 1871 is a case in point. A group of investors in the Elyton Land Company bribed the official surveyor of where 2 railroads were supposed to intersect to put that intersection adjacent to land that they bought in Jefferson County, Alabama. The surveyor, bribed by a share of the company's stock, did one better, and rather than simply crossing the rail lines, ran them parallel for 1,000 yards along the southern boundary of the Elyton Company's holdings. This became downtown Birmingham. What really made Birmingham important was that it sat in a valley surrounded by abundant coal, iron ore, and limestone. Limestone's for flux. We'll talk about this more in just a bit. It wasn't long before boosters and capitalists, as they called themselves, built pig iron furnaces there. Birmingham pig iron then went to nearby foundries to be processed into usable products. Cast iron pipe in Birmingham and Chattanooga, which also produced pig iron, iron ore, boilers, and food products. Stoves in Rome, Georgia. Rail car undercarriages in Anniston, Alabama. In 1886, a time of prosperity, The Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company entered Birmingham and in 1907 became the local subsidiary of U.S. Steel Corporation after buying up a number of other Birmingham companies and itself being bought by U.S. Steel. It continued operations under the name TCI into the 1950s. Many of its workers in its mines were leased state convicts, something we don't talk about much, but which was a great evil in this era. I've included this image to give you an idea of how heavy industry operated. Although heavy industry was much more capital intensive than earlier versions or than lighter industry, it still relied on vast numbers of workers. That is, industry was not particularly mechanized, certainly not as mechanized as it became. While industry provided work and wages, that work was brutal in many cases and wages were universally low. Another thing to consider is that industries did not operate year-round as they do now. Many closed from 3 to 6 months every year as demand fluctuated or as they retooled. This image shows how one Birmingham furnace made pig iron, and it's pretty typical. Workers charged, that is loaded the furnace to the left, with coal or coke, iron ore, and limestone flux, then cooked the mixture until the iron was molten. In front of the furnace, workers drew channels into the sand floor, then off each channel excavated larger openings. After workers tapped the furnace, molten iron flowed down the channels into the openings, which reminded the farm boys who worked the iron, they were called puddlers, of the way sows nurse their piglets, thus pig iron. There were no safety measures to speak of. Puddlers walked atop the molten pigs with shoes nailed to thick wooden boards as an extra sole, like a snowshoe or a very short ski, directing the iron flow into the pigs. This graph will give you an idea of the growth of pig iron production in the U.S. South, that is the blue area at the bottom, and in the U.S. as a whole, the lighter area at the top. Much of this lecture notes the growth of Southern economy, and when you hear the numbers in isolation, they sound pretty spectacular. But this graph reminds us that even though Southern production and its economy grew, the output of the overall U.S. economy was not only much greater, but also grew at a more rapid rate. Slower growth, excessive localism, hyperstable population, that is little in or out migration until the 20th century, and blatant white supremacy pretty much defined the U.S. South in the era after the Civil War. And the legacy of these characteristics continues today. Southern exceptionalism, such as it is, comes from these things. Another example of an industry that expanded in the South is cigarette manufacturing. The Duke family of Durham, North Carolina, employed 125 workers hand-rolling cigarettes, then called ready-mades. An expert roller could make 4 per minute, and in 1883, the crew at Duke produced 250,000 cigarettes per day. This pace could not keep up with demand. So a decade earlier, in 1875, a Richmond, Virginia tobacco company offered a large prize to an investor who could automate cigarette making. James Bonsack of Virginia won the prize in 1880 with a machine that could ready roll 200 per minute, or 120,000 per 10-hour shift. Although Bonsack's machine malfunctioned frequently, James Duke, who ran the Duke Company, leased 2 of them in 1884. They came with a mechanic, William O'Brien, who along with James Duke improved the machine's operation so much that soon Duke reduced his costs by 25% and undercut his competition. Duke cornered 40% of the cigarette market by 1890. Then that same year bought out 4 competitors to make the American Tobacco Company that immediately controlled 90% of the cigarette market. American Tobacco fell to an anti-monopoly suit in 1906 and split into 4 entities. One of the foremost industrialists in the South, James Duke, diversified from cigarettes into electrical power development. He was actually trained as an electrical engineer. opening a company later called Duke Power that became today's giant Duke Energy. In 1924, he left a massive endowment to Trinity College, which changed its name to Duke University. Let's look for a moment at the consumption of tobacco products in the U.S., particularly the dominance of cigarettes and their rise in popularity after 1915. Cigarettes, because of the effects of nicotine, were the drug of choice provided to U.S. soldiers in World Wars I and II, as well as being encouraged among industrial workers. You can see that the use of all tobacco products driven by cigarettes peaked in about 1953 and has declined ever since. Nevertheless, it is still a very profitable market. Let's look now at extractive industries. These are akin to agriculture, but tend to produce products one step up from raw materials, though not as value-added as manufactured products. We'll examine the naval stores and lumber industry, petroleum extraction, coal and iron mining, and discuss a variety of other extractives. Remember, these are examples, and there are a bevy of industries that we do not have time to examine here. Before petroleum-based tar became ubiquitous, waterproofing of ship's hulls, caulking, and lines used gum and resin products distilled from pine tree sap. These materials have long been called naval stores, even after ship makers were no longer the major market for them. North Carolina led in naval stores production from the 1720s to the Civil War, producing 96% of all U.S. output in 1840. The industry declined in North Carolina after the Civil War, shifting to Georgia, Alabama, Florida, and Louisiana. Georgia was the national leader from 1890 to 1905, replaced by Florida 1905 to 1923, then Georgia regained the lead into the 1960s. Turpentine, the distilled spirits of pine sap, is a solvent but can also be used as a fuel for lamps, and pine resin found use in soap and varnish, shellac. Railroads became a large consumer of pine tar to waterproof rail ties. You can see in this image that workers are cutting cat faces into two sides of pine trees. The V-shaped cuts let sap drain into a box at the tree bottom. Even after the development of the less intrusive Hurdy cup sap catching system in 1902 in Georgia, this activity wrecked trees. They were then harvested as second-grade lumber as the market for frame houses and wood for rail cars expanded simultaneously with the playing out of the great forests of the North Woods. The piney woods of the southern coastal plain from Savannah to Texas then fell to the saw. Lumber production increased by over 1,600% from 1869 to 1909 in the South, particularly after railroads opened the interior of the piney woods to exploitation. Timber companies were large for the time, but were unlike modern megacorporations. For example, the Call family of Pennsylvania began in 1889 acquiring what by 1911 became 80,000 acres near Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and the Scotch Lumber Company, controlled by two Wisconsin men, owned over 145,000 acres of forest in West Alabama by 1910. Second growth forests of slash pine replaced the longleaf virgin pine on lands that were not turned to agriculture, and southern paper mills that had been set up to convert sawdust into paper then demonstrated that slash pine could be used to make craft paper and newsprint at low cost. By the 1920s, large paper companies began locating mills in the South, and corporations bought vast tracts of land that they managed sustainably. The St. Joe Paper Company, formed in Port St. Joe in 1936, for instance, owned more than 567,000 acres of land in Florida by 2012. By then, it had changed from a paper maker to a land development concern. Petroleum, that is oil, had been used for millennia from natural seeps for waterproofing and as lubricants. Once scientists discovered that crude oil could produce kerosene, a substitute for whale oil in lamps, Americans earnestly searched for a sufficient supply. In Titusville, Pennsylvania, in 1859, the first drilled oil well opened a field, and the U.S. became the largest oil producer in the world for a while. The immense market that came with the growth of chemical research and expanding industry made fortunes for oil barons like John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil and even a significant number of his competitors. The oil industry in the South putted along until an exploratory well at Spindletop Hill near Beaumont, Texas, blew the first gusher. That gusher was a 100-foot plume of oil that blew 100,000 barrels per day for 9 days until crews could cap it. It launched an oil boom and the modern oil industry. Oil production peaked early in 1902 with 17 million barrels, but fell to 10,000 by 1904. Nevertheless, the find spurred locals into forming oil companies like Texaco, the Texas Oil Company, Gulf Oil, combined now into Chevron, Sun Oil, and a precursor to Exxon. You can see from this map that Spindletop tapped into an enormous oil field along the U.S. Gulf Coast. Though this map doesn't show it, that field extends into the Gulf of Mexico. Refineries followed the boom at Spindletop and discoveries of oil in Louisiana soon thereafter, setting up the Gulf Coast of the U.S. South as a principal extraction and refining region of the world. Other huge fields in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas created an oil boom there too. Tulsa became the capital of U.S. oil production before the Gulf wells began producing. Another extractive industry was coal and iron mining that, along with limestone quarrying, fed the furnaces of the southern iron industry. You can see the coal fields of the Appalachians, the northern, central, and southern sections. The extensive Warrior coal field at the southern end of the section was in Alabama, where its proximity to iron ore and limestone deposits led the investors to develop first the town of Birmingham, then its pig iron, cast iron, and steel industry. You can see on this map where the coal, gray, brown hematite ore, tan, and rich red iron ore lay. Birmingham is marked by the star. Limestone does not show on this map, but it exists southeast of Birmingham, within 30 miles and easily accessible by railroad. We see this table of the change in value of economic indicators and products from 1880 to 1912, drawn from the article Definite Achievements of the South Since 1880 in the Manufacturer's Record of Baltimore, February 22, 1912, page 5. While population of the South grew 77.5%, other indicators grew more dramatically. Some are obvious. The number of spindles is how we generally measure cotton textile mill growth, and this number indicates that industry expanded 15 times its 1880 size. We also see that pig iron tonnage expanded almost 6 times in that same era. Coke, derived from coal, grew by over 23 times and literally fueled the growth of pig iron. We also see increases in extractive and financial industries as well as in agriculture. King cotton regained its throne in large part because of the fertilizer industry, beginning with importation of industrial scale quantities of bat guano from Peru, made possible by railroads, and the phosphate industry. Phosphates, used for fertilizer, experienced a boom that began in the Carolina rice areas as the, quote, river phosphate industry, unquote, in the 1870s. Low country rice planters made ends meet by mining phosphates from outcrops in riverbeds. By 1882, production was at its highest, with 11 businesses operating in South Carolina. River divers were able to mine a ton of rock per day and earn $18 per week, which was a tremendous sum. Business fell beginning in 1890 and never recovered. But by that time, the guano industry had expanded and Chilean phosphate mines began significant production. Let's look now at agriculture. Agriculture was the greatest economic activity in the South between the Civil War and World War I. Like I said, King Cotton regained its throne between the Civil War and World War I, though as we'll see, Southern agriculture had diversified at least somewhat. We can see from the statistics on this slide that cotton cultivation came back with a bang. Acreage tripled and yield climbed by almost 5 times. This is usually the result of fertilizer being available for marginal acreage like the wiregrass of South Alabama, Georgia, and North Florida. Cotton prices plummeted, which perversely led farmers to grow more of it. There was a slight rise in price from 1895 to 1900, another plummet. Then after the disastrous year of 1913-1914, a large jump in price because of the demands of World War I. Southern cotton's value was half again greater than the entire value of gold and silver mined during the 30 years between 1880 and 1910, though that was distributed poorly by region and by class and caste. Historian Michael Schwartz reports that cotton had a greater hold on farmers than was previously understood because of figures hidden in the way the census recorded land ownership. He claims that in 1900, cotton produced 46% of the cash income of all agriculture and consumed 66% of all farmlands. Furthermore, a decade earlier, between 60 and 90% of all farmers were cotton tenants. This map of the cotton growing area of the South, particularly the excellent cottonlands of the Black Belt and the associated cottonlands north and south of it. This map doesn't show all cottonlands. For example, the Tennessee River Valley at one time produced more cotton than anywhere else in Alabama and still produces cotton today, but it's not listed on here. Nevertheless, this gives you an idea of how extensive cotton cultivation actually was. In addition to cotton, rice cultivation in the low country of Georgia and South Carolina revived a bit after planters reclaimed their lands during Reconstruction. This chart shows the effects of national and global economic changes on rice fortunes from before the Civil War until after World War I. The drop in Carolina rice after 1849 was due to the opening of the Suez Canal, the rise of steamboats, plus competition from Southeast Asian producers. Then after 1876, favorable treatment for Hawaiian rice made it competitive with Carolina rice. Fortunes revived with tariff protection after 1883, but fell when new domestic rice producing areas opened in the late 1880s, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas, with New Orleans replacing Charleston as the hub of the U.S. rice industry. By 1909, Louisiana produced almost 50% of U.S. rice, with Texas producing 41%, and by 1919, Arkansas and California both produced almost 20% of the U.S. rice harvest. This 2005 map shows the westward shift of rice production. Southern states, particularly Arkansas and Mississippi, Louisiana, and the Texas Gulf Coast still produce exceptional amounts of rice. To appear on this map, a county had to produce over 18,000 bushels of rice. You can see that the Carolina and Georgia rice areas produce too little to appear here. Tobacco is the last crop we'll look at, not because there were only 3 crops that recovered after the Civil War, but because these 3, cotton, rice, tobacco, provide excellent examples of the process by which major field crop agriculture operated between the Civil War and World War I. You can see from this slide that tobacco acreage and yields increased by almost the same amount, which means that yields per acre did not increase like they did for cotton. What happened instead is that new tobacco lands opened as bright tobacco, appropriate for cigarettes rather than for cigars, pipes, snuff, or chewing tobacco, expanded in importance. The picture you see here is shade-grown tobacco, a highly specialized product used as cigar wrappers. Although this field is in Americus, Georgia, much shade-grown tobacco was produced in North Florida. This map provides an overview of tobacco areas where flue-cured, that is bright tobacco, dominated the southeast and south of the Appalachian Spine, and light air-cured dominated Tennessee and Kentucky. One of the most prominent aspects of Southern agriculture in the postbellum era is less the crops grown and more the way Southerners organize rural life. Remember, people live in the short term. They must have food, fiber, shelter, and income in order to survive. So in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, when Southern agriculture was in shambles, they had to figure out what to do. Couple these immediate needs with shock and bitterness from the war, the loss of approximately $4 billion of capital because of emancipation of the enslaved population, which contributed to a region-wide multi-year economic depression, and the grasping for power of the antebellum elites. And these folks ended up with the restoration of the plantation system. Without slavery, however, plantations had to change their very nature. Historian Gavin Wright argues that antebellum planters were less landlords than they were labor lords. When lands played out, many planters took their main economic asset, enslaved people, to new lands, while others bought out their smaller neighbors. Enslaved labor, not land, was what provided their source of wealth. With emancipation, labor had to be paid somehow, so land became the planter's greatest asset. Thus we see migration of the well-to-do slow to a trickle as they became anchored to their land. At the same time, the South was cash poor, so there was little medium of exchange to pay agricultural workers, white or black. One more thing, some plantations tried to work laborers in the old gang system, but found too few willing to work the old slave way. Yet some workers asked, what defines freedom? One answer was the ability to control one's labor and the ability to control a plot of land. Since former slaves and poor whites had little cash and no way to accumulate capital, and planters had too little cash to pay workers who didn't want to work for wages anyway, together they developed sharecropping. Given the reputation sharecropping has, the way I've talked about its origins sounds a bit too chipper. My point is that, at the beginning, many participants found it less degrading than wage labor. It was only after the so-called Redeemers retook state legislatures that unscrupulous planters could secure lien laws that turned sharecroppers into virtual serfs through debt peonage. Sharecropping worked like this. A farm family who could not raise capital and so needed credit exchanged a portion of their crop as rent and another portion to pay for what they called furnish, seeds, tools, and food enough to make it from crop to crop. For their part, planters provided the land and often were involved with the furnishing end of the business. They might have owned the store that furnished or, as was common, were related to the furnishing merchant. Sharecropping became a social and economic problem when lien laws forced debtors to pay for land and furnish before they could make an annual contract with another planter, with the planters and merchants keeping the books that they were not legally obliged to show to the croppers, and the illiterate and often innumerate croppers were unable to understand the accounts anyway. An entire system of debt peonage evolved, coupled with increasingly virulent white supremacy and its attendant systems. Sharecropping and tenant farming, those who paid with cash rather than pledging a portion of the crop, made up to 60% of farmers in 1910 Alabama. Not all croppers and tenants suffered from the maliciousness of the crop lien system, but in areas where there had to be a stable labor supply of farm workers, debt peonage was rife. Debtors could not leave the land even when industry offered suitable wages. The racial caste system that developed after 1890, Jim Crow, was based in part on segregated industrial employment designed to consign workers to rural labor. This lecture has covered, at least superficially, the economy of the New South from the Civil War until World War I. We discussed manufacturing of cotton textiles, iron, tobacco products, which was relatively new at the scale it achieved. We also discussed extractive industries such as naval stores and lumber, petroleum and mining, and we talked about agriculture. We finished with a discussion of how agriculture was organized after the Civil War, with the ascendancy of tenancy and crop lien leading to debt peonage. Overall, the economy grew, sometimes quite well. But remember that the starting point for growth was pretty low. So the 43,000% growth in production of petroleum, for example, compared to almost no production at the beginning of the time period we're covering. Nevertheless, this discussion demonstrates that the New South wanted to develop and to diversify economically, and made heroic efforts to do so, even if those efforts were not particularly productive compared to the rest of the nation. This ends the lecture. And as always, thank you for your attention.